Beneath the grim, grey walls of the Tower of London, on a small, secluded patch of grass called Tower Green, the silence was once shattered by the soft thud of final footsteps, the whispered prayers of the condemned, and the sudden, sickening swoosh of an axe that ended lives in private, away from the roaring crowds of Tower Hill. This was no ordinary execution ground. It was a hidden stage reserved for the most dangerous, the most noble, or the most inconvenient souls whose deaths the crown wanted controlled, contained, and carefully messaged to the world. William the Conqueror had raised these stones in the late 11th century as a towering symbol of Norman domination, a fortress that would serve for centuries as royal palace, treasury, armory, menagerie, and prison, but by the late medieval and Tudor periods it had taken on a far darker identity. Here, in the heart of the kingdom, highborn prisoners were not merely held, but quietly erased when their existence threatened the delicate balance of power, faith, or succession. Executions inside the tower were exceedingly rare, deliberately so, because public beheadings on Tower Hill were for common traitors, rebels, and criminals who could be made examples of before thousands. Yet those of royal blood, great nobles, or women whose deaths might provoke sympathy, outrage, or rebellion were brought instead to this private lawn where the monarch could dictate every detail: who watched, what was said, and how the story would later be told. And among those who walked the short, dreadful path to the scaffold on Tower Green, the women stand out with particular tragedy, women accused of treason, adultery, heresy, or simply of existing at the wrong moment in history, women whose executions were designed not only to end their lives, but to obliterate their names from the pages of power, from the annals of faith, and sometimes from memory itself. There was Lady Jane Grey, the brilliant 16-year-old who never wanted the crown that killed her; Margaret Pole, the 67-year-old Plantagenet countess, butchered in a frenzy of blows by an incompetent headsman; Askew, the gentle scholar racked until her joints were torn apart, and then burned alive for daring to read the Bible in English; and Catherine Howard, the teenage queen barely out of girlhood, who danced into Henry VII's heart only to be marched out of it straight to the block for the crime of being young, pretty, and indiscreet. Their stories are woven together by the same cold stones, the same private grass, the same merciless logic of power that decided innocence, age, faith, and youth were irrelevant when the throne felt threatened. It began, as so many Tudor tragedies did, with religion and succession. In the stifling summer of 1553, King Edward VI, the frail boy king, lay dying, and the Protestant nobles who surrounded him panicked at the thought of his Catholic half-sister Mary inheriting the crown. They needed a Protestant heir, and they found one in Lady Jane Grey, the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, a girl whose blood was undeniably royal and whose devout Protestant faith had been carefully cultivated by some of the fiercest reformers in the land. Jane was clever, serious, fluent in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, and utterly uninterested in power. When they told her she was now queen, she fainted from shock, and upon recovering, wept bitterly, insisting she had no desire for the throne, but her parents, her husband Guildford Dudley, and most of all the ruthless Duke of Northumberland bullied and threatened her until she accepted the crown with trembling hands. For 9 days in July 1553, she was Queen Jane, signing documents Jane the Queen, while Mary gathered an army and the country rose almost unanimously for the daughter of Henry VII. On 19 July, Mary was proclaimed Queen in London, and Jane, stripped of her brief title, became simply Lady Jane Grey again, a prisoner in the Tower. At first her life was spared. She was young, innocent of any real crime, and Mary was inclined toward mercy. Jane spent her imprisonment reading, praying, and writing letters of heartbreaking clarity and faith. But in January 1554, Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger launched a rebellion to put Jane back on the throne and depose the Catholic Queen. Though Jane had no part in the plot and begged Wyatt to stop, her very existence now posed an unbearable risk to Mary. On 12 February 1554, the 17-year-old girl, she had turned 17 only a few months earlier, was told she would die that morning. Dressed in somber black, clutching her prayer book, she watched from the window of her prison as her young husband Guildford was taken out first and beheaded on Tower Hill. Then it was her turn. She walked calmly to the scaffold on Tower Green, climbed the steps without assistance, and delivered a short, dignified speech in a clear voice. "Good people, I am come hither to die, and by a law I am condemned to the same. The fact indeed against the Queen's Highness was unlawful, and the consenting thereunto by me, I do wash my hands thereof in innocency." Blindfolded, she was led forward to the block, but in the darkness she could not find it. Her composure cracked for a heartbreaking moment as she cried out, "What shall I do? Where is it?" A bystander gently guided her hands to the wood. She laid her head down, stretched out her arms, and whispered, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." The axe fell once, cleanly. England's youngest and most reluctant queen was gone, a sacrifice to the ambitions of men and the brutal mathematics of dynasty. Nearly a century earlier, in the paranoid final years of Henry VII's reign, another innocent woman met a far more gruesome end on the very same patch of grass. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was 67 years old, a white-haired Plantagenet princess who had outlived the Wars of the Roses, served Catherine of Aragon faithfully, and been governess to Princess Mary. Her only crime was her blood and her son. Cardinal Reginald Pole, living in exile in Rome, had written a scorching treatise denouncing Henry as a tyrant and questioning the legitimacy of his marriage to Anne Boleyn. Henry, furious and increasingly unstable, decided to punish the mother for the son she could not control. In November 1538, Margaret was arrested at her home, her belongings confiscated, and she was thrown into the Tower without trial or formal charge. For 2.5 years, she endured damp, cold cells, inadequate clothing, and failing health, while Henry's counselors fabricated evidence of treason that never quite materialized. On the morning of 27 May 1541, she was abruptly informed that she would be executed that same day. Frail, bewildered, and protesting her innocence, she was dragged to Tower Green. What happened next horrified even the hardened men who witnessed it. Margaret refused to lay her head on the block, declaring again and again that she was no traitor. The executioner, a young and inexperienced man, panicked. When she was finally forced down, his first blow glanced off her shoulder. She managed to stand, blood pouring down her dress, and tried to escape. He chased her around the scaffold, hacking wildly at her head and shoulders. It took 11 blows to kill her. One chronicler wrote that she was butchered rather than beheaded. Her grey hair was matted with blood, her body mutilated almost beyond recognition. They buried her hastily in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula without ceremony or marker. To this day, her grave is unmarked, her death one of the most shocking acts of judicial murder in English history. 5 years later, in the same reign but for entirely different reasons, another woman endured horrors almost beyond imagining inside the Tower before meeting her death outside it. Askew was a gentlewoman from Lincolnshire, intelligent, articulate, and utterly convinced of the Protestant faith at a time when Henry VII's England swung violently between Catholic and Reformed doctrines. Married against her will to a conservative Catholic, she eventually left him and came to London to preach and distribute forbidden Protestant books. Her wit and courage made her famous and dangerous. Arrested twice, questioned, and released, she was finally seized again in 1546, when conservative courtiers hoped to use her to bring down Queen Catherine Parr, who shared Anne's beliefs. To force her to name names, the Lord Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley and the notorious Richard Rich took her to the Tower and personally operated the rack. They stretched her body until her shoulders, elbows, hips, and knees were dislocated. No highborn woman had ever been tortured in the Tower before. Even the lieutenant of the Tower protested that it was illegal. Anne refused to betray anyone. Crippled and unable to walk, she was carried in a chair to Smithfield on 16 July 1546 and chained to the stake alongside 3 men. As the flames rose, a bag of gunpowder hung around her neck exploded, ending her agony quickly. Before she died, she had smuggled out a vivid account of her examinations and torture that was published abroad and became one of the first books in English known to be written by a woman. Her courage and her words echoed long after the fire consumed her body. And then there was Catherine Howard, barely 17, when she caught the eye of the aging, obese, and increasingly tyrannical Henry VII in 1539. Cousin to the executed Anne Boleyn, raised carelessly in the lax household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, Catherine was pretty, vivacious, and utterly unprepared for the deadly intrigue of the court. Henry, besotted, married her within weeks of annulling his marriage to Anne of Cleves, and called her his rose without a thorn. For a brief, dazzling year she was queen, showered with jewels and adoration. But her past caught up with her, relationships, or at least serious flirtations, with men before her marriage, and fatally, meetings during her queenship with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber. When the rumors reached Henry, he refused to believe them at first, but the evidence was overwhelming. In November 1541, Catherine was stripped of her title and sent by barge to the Tower, screaming in terror as she was dragged aboard. She was never granted a trial. Confined first in luxurious apartments and then in colder cells, she spent her last days in hysteria and despair. On the night before her execution, she asked for the block to be brought to her room so she could practice laying her head upon it, rehearsing her own death like a child practicing a dance. On the morning of 13 February 1542, she was led to Tower Green, trembling so violently she could barely stand. Tradition says her last words were, "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper," though whether she truly said them or not, the story captures the tragedy of a girl who never understood the rules of the deadly game she had been forced to play. The axe fell, and the fifth wife of Henry VIII joined her cousin Anne Boleyn in an unmarked grave beneath the chapel floor. 4 women, 4 different reigns, 4 different reasons, yet the same small patch of grass drank their blood. Jane Grey, innocent pawn of religious politics; Margaret Pole, elderly victim of a king's vengeance against her son; Anne Askew, martyr for the right to read scripture in her own language; Catherine Howard, frivolous teenager destroyed by her own careless youth. Each walked to Tower Green under guard. Each felt the rough wood of the block against her neck. Each died because power, when frightened, does not distinguish between guilt and inconvenience. Their stories linger in the stones of the tower like frost that never quite melts away, a quiet, chilling reminder that behind the pomp of crowns and the grandeur of fortresses, the price of absolute authority has often been measured in the lives of the young, the faithful, and the innocent who happened to stand too close to the throne when it began to shake. The grass on Tower Green has been replaced many times over the centuries, but those who walk across it today still feel, in some indefinable way, the weight of those final footsteps, the tremor in those last prayers, and the cold, merciless certainty that in the shadow of the White Tower, justice was never blind. It simply closed its eyes when the king commanded it.